WrestleMania 5 is one of those special shows to me that 25 years later still holds a special place in this semi-defective old heart. It does. It's not the greatest WrestleMania of all time, but, you know, there's that one thing above all else that really, truly gives this event its special place in my heart, always has and always will. WrestleMania 5. They had so much fun with WrestleMania 4 at the Trump Plaza that they went back again for WrestleMania 5, and this time the mega powers collide. Ooh, yeah. Well, let me tell you something, brother. But we'll get to that in a couple of moments. As far as this show goes, um, when I look at today's WWE, and they maybe have 8 matches for a 4-hour WrestleMania, and I think that's inexcusable, and it's just not enough. This is again one of these examples here where you had 14 matches, and to be fair to the WWF, this was a different time where WrestleMania was the big show of the year, and the guys got paid the most off of WrestleMania, so this was kind of in a way a reward for these guys having gone on the road and being away from their families for 300 plus days a year. You had to find a way to get them on this card, as many of them as possible, so that way they would actually get paid, because a good portion of what they made throughout the year came from WrestleMania, especially during this time. So you have 14 matches here, probably a couple too many. Now, that means some shorter matches, and that just kind of happens. But one interesting note about this is you had 5 tag team matches on the card, which I think also at the same point in time shows what was a good problem for the WWF at the time. You had a very talented, very stacked, very deep, very loaded talent roster, both just in general and in particular in your tag team division. You only wish the talent roster in the WWE was anywhere near as good today as it was back then. And that's something that is striking as you go through and you watch this show. The show kicks off with former Bobby the Brain Heenan client Hercules beating current Bobby the Brain Heenan client King Haku in a short little opening match. But again, former Heenan client versus current Heenan client. This opening match was about Bobby the Brain Heenan. Nothing wrong with that. You have the Twin Towers beat the Rockers. This was the Rockers' first WrestleMania match here. And the Twin Towers, I always enjoyed as a tag team. I thought they were really good. And of course, they were important players in this build up to WrestleMania 5 because they were very key components of the Mega Powers splitting and exploding at the seams. You got Brutus the Barber Beefcake and Ted DiBiase fighting to a double countout. This is where the $1 Million Belt, I think, made its pay-per-view debut, and I always loved the $1 Million Belt. I wish he would have defended it more at pay-per-views, frankly. You had the Bushwhackers defeat the Fabulous Russos in another tag match, and this was okay. But again, if anything else, it speaks to the depth of the tag team division at that time and the unique characters at the time and the fact that these guys were well-oiled machines as teams. The Bushwhackers had their shtick and they knew what they were doing. The Fabulous Russos had their shtick and they knew what they were doing. And it just made for when you got guys like this, teams like this would probably be tag team champions today. These guys at this time were second-run tag teams compared to some of the other guys. You have a kind of sad, depressing match in the middle just because of when you look back at it now and these guys are no longer around. But Mr. Perfect defeating the Blue Blazer, 2 very talented individuals that are sadly no longer with us, unfortunately. But a good kind of introductory WrestleMania match for Mr. Perfect coming off at the heels of his great vignette series because everything that he did was perfect. You had Demolition and the Powers of Pain with Mr. Fuji in a 2-on-3 handicap match for the WWF Tag Team Championships. And the interesting thing about this is at Survivor Series 88, you had actually executed a double turn where Demolition at that time had been aligned with Mr. Fuji and they were the heels. They turned face as Mr. Fuji turned on them and aligned themselves with the babyface Powers of Pain, who were now heels. And that is what ultimately led to this match here. Demolition was a really good tag team. Yes, they were Road Warrior ripoffs. I'll never dispute that. But they were a really good tag team in the WWF at that time. And they were really, really good tag team champions. And they had an okay match here with the Powers of Pain and retained their tag team titles. Now, Dino Bravo having a match on this card should knock it down a little bit, and it does. Dino Bravo winning a WrestleMania match definitely hurts this card a little bit. But at least he's dead. He beat Ronnie Garvin. I can't believe that. Who the fuck booked that shit? Oh, Christ. You had the Brainbusters take on and defeat Strike Force of Rick Martel and Tino Santana. You know, the Brainbusters were a really good tag team in the WWF, and Strikeforce had a time where they were a really good tag team, you know, former tag champions, and they were a good tag team in the WWF. One of the featured matches on this card was Jake the Snake Roberts taking on Andre the Giant, and this had been built up for a little while. And this was always one of these feuds that I thought was interesting, even though you never really, I think, fully got a payoff. It was kind of one of those things. We need something for Andre to do at WrestleMania 5. We need something for Jake to do at WrestleMania 5. We want to establish Jake as a top guy here, and we want to make sure that Andre's in a featured spot because he is still an attraction and he is still a draw. And, you know, the whole interesting story behind this being the fact that, you know, even somebody like Andre the Giant has fears. And Jake the Snake, even if you look at him, he's a big guy, you know, maybe 6'8", 280 pounds, you know, but he still doesn't measure up to Andre. But he has that ultimate ace in the hole, that snake in the grass, you will. The snake, Damien. And they played very well off of this. And this is one of these matches, and this is one of these feuds. And if you're into great technical wrestling and you're into, you know, great physicality in the ring, this is not for you. If you were into storytelling, you were into character development, and you were into feud progression, this is a match for you. It told a very good story, and this is something that I look back on very fondly 25 years later. One thing that I don't think really worked well on this card, even though it seemed like it had a lot going for it on paper, was a Piper's Pit segment, with Morton Downey Jr. Now, Downey Jr. was, what's the best way to put this? He was kind of like a television shock jock in the 80s. He was one of the loudest mouths around, and, you know, on paper, on the surface, in theory, it looked like him coming into Piper's Pit to have a verbal battle with Roddy Piper would seem like something that was really, really interesting, had a lot going for it, and would deliver a big-time memorable WrestleMania moment. And maybe it did, with Brother Love coming out and mocking Roddy Piper, and Roddy Piper eventually coming in and cleaning house, if you will, and eventually after Morton Downey Jr. continuously blows a cigarette smoke in his face, he puts him out with a fire extinguisher. You know, while that's kind of cool, and maybe that is a WrestleMania moment in its own way, the segment just really doesn't hold up that well, and it just really is kind of flat. And I don't think the crowd there ever really got behind it or never really got into it. And I certainly didn't when I was watching it, which is kind of a shame because, like I said, it was one of those things that this WrestleMania 5 show was actually built around. You were bringing in somebody at the time who, again, was very, very hot, Morton Downey Jr., that kind of shock television jock, if you will. You bring him into Piper's Pit to square off against one of the greatest talkers in the history of the business. You're thinking on the surface, heading into it, that this is going to be something great and incredible. And it just never really developed or materialized, sadly. And you had another tag match. You had the Hart Foundation defeating the Honky Tonk Man and Greg the Hammer Valentine. You know, like I said, it was just amazing when going back and watching a show like WrestleMania 5, just how talented and deep and loaded this talent roster was at this time. And in particular, how talented and deep and loaded the tag team division was at this time. You had another interesting match here, to me, another really good feud. Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior over the Intercontinental Championship. It's not every day you can sit there and say you beat the Ultimate Warrior, but Rick Rude did here at WrestleMania 5. Sure, with the help of Bobby the Brain Heenan, but Warrior had that IC title since SummerSlam '88 when he came up in shocking fashion as a surprise opponent for the Honky Tonk Man, beat him in like 30-something seconds. He had held the belt ever since. You had this feud really kicking off at Royal Rumble '89 with the big pose down segment. I love the feud between Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior. I absolutely love this feud. And it really made for a really good title feud in 1990 once Ultimate Warrior won the WWF Championship. But here, really, really good feud. And this was at a time where you're trying to build up Rick Rude as a potential big-time player down the road, as a future opponent perhaps for the Ultimate Warrior, somebody that could actually beat the Ultimate Warrior, which he did here. And you're building up the Ultimate Warrior to be that next great babyface, that next great draw, that next huge WWF larger-than-life comic book attraction. And they were doing that here. So it was a good match, and I love this feud so much. And, you know, it's just amazing to me that it's now 2014 and Ultimate Warrior's finally getting his rightful place in the WWE Hall of Fame. But Rick Rude is still on the outside looking in. What a shame. Because I even think, with all the things that Ultimate Warrior has said over the years about so many different people and knocked so many different people, one of the few people that he's never knocked that I can recall, one of the few people he's never talked any shit about is Rick Rude. And that's for a reason, because Rick Rude was that damn good. And to me, this match was a good Intercontinental Championship match. You got a surprising title change here because you didn't think Rick Rude could beat the Ultimate Warrior. He was the Ultimate Warrior, but he did. And it wasn't the last time these two would have a good piece of business, in my opinion. You had Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Bad News Brown fight to a double disqualification. You had, for some reason, Terry Taylor, the Red Rooster, get a WrestleMania match against Bobby the Brain Heenan. Oh, God. Good thing about that one was short. You blinked and you missed it. And if you missed it, you didn't miss anything. Wasn't exactly missing it. But really, this show is all about one match. This show was all built around one feud. And that was the Mega Powers exploding. This was about Hulk Hogan taking on Randy the Macho Man Savage for the WWF Championship. Now, the Mega Powers had dominated the WWF, frankly, since late 1987. They dominated all of 1988. And now you get into 1989, and they're starting to tease the friction and the tension between the two of them. And they're making it seem like Savage believes that Hogan has lust in his eyes, both for his belt and for his woman. And, Hogan thinks that Savage is being unreasonable, and he would never do that to his best friend in the whole world. And it all exploded on a Saturday night's main event where the Mega Powers faced off against the Twin Towers, Hakeem, and the Big Boss Man. This is where they played their role, because when Miss Elizabeth got knocked out and Hogan took off and took Miss Elizabeth to the back, and he left Savage there to fight the both of them by himself, and then he came back, and eventually Savage is sitting there. He finally gets ready to tag Hogan, and he fucking bitch slaps the shit out of him and hops out and says, "Fuck you, you're on your own." This leads to that classic kind of corny segment in the back where Hogan comes back afterwards to find out if Miss Elizabeth's okay, and Savage wipes him out, and you're off to the races from there. The doctored footage of Hogan and what he said about Elizabeth. Oh, God. You get to WrestleMania 5 here, and the Mega Powers are set to explode. And the way they played off Elizabeth here would seem incredibly corny today, but, she was going to be there to support both individuals. In 1989, this worked, and this worked very well. Miss Elizabeth was a tremendous heat magnet for the Macho Man Randy Savage, and she was a tremendous attraction. And it's probably a shame that we'll never get her in the WWE Hall of Fame, because when you talk about valets and you talk about managers that had impact, she had an impact. She had a tremendous impact. She was a primary reason. Sure, the Macho Man Randy Savage was an incredibly talented performer. Nobody will ever take that away from him, at least while they're looking me in the face. However, it didn't hurt having that built-in heat magnet, Miss Elizabeth. And the way she was incorporated into this storyline, magnificent. And frankly, to me, here at WrestleMania 5, this was the first really actually great main event match for the title. What I mean is, whereas Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3, that was in front of 93,000 people, and that was a tremendous match because it was memorable, because it had the big moments. You had drawn 93,000 people. From an actual wrestling match standpoint, this was to me like the first really good world title main event WrestleMania match from that standpoint. Obviously this doesn't measure up to Steamboat Savage at WrestleMania 3 in that standpoint, but this match is definitely a lot better from a wrestling match standpoint than a Hogan and Andre at a WrestleMania 3 was. It told a similarly effective story like Hogan and Andre did at WrestleMania 3, but in a different and unique way. And I always go back and watch this show. And whenever I go back to watch this show, frankly, I have to admit, I'm just ready to get to the main event. And usually I end up skipping through different stuff to get to the main event. Because why? Because this was the only thing that all these years later I truly choose to remember. The only thing I truly choose to care about. Because it was the event, the match that this entire show was built around. Savage and Hogan did a lot of good business in the WWF in 88. And they ended up going on after this and doing some more good business in 89. I don't know if you call it good business when they brought in Zeus, but hey, they built other major pay-per-views like SummerSlam around this feud. And, it just always is interesting for me to go back and watch an event like this. Two of my all-time favorites, Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man Randy Savage, squaring off here. This to me was a story that was almost 2 years in the making, and at that time I was heartbroken because the Macho Man had turned on Hogan, and I loved Hogan, and I loved the Macho Man, and I couldn't believe why the Macho Man would turn on his best friend Hogan. It still kind of tugs at me like that to this day. This is one of these matches that when I go back and watch it, I am a kid again. And I always am thankful for that. And I am always appreciative of that. And that's why this show always gets a little bit of a better grade for me than maybe, frankly, it deserves. Now, it wasn't a bad WrestleMania. No, it wasn't. You had some memorable matches to me. Rick Rude winning the IC title from the Ultimate Warrior is a memorable match. All the tag team matches on this card. And then, obviously, the main event. This is like a B or B minus show to me. And the reason being is because of the loaded, talented talent roster and because of the main event, frankly. What it means. The mania and the madness were no more, and they exploded here. And back when I was a kid, I probably exploded in my pants. Unfortunately, at that time, that would probably mean you'd either piss or crap yourself when you're 8 years old. But hey, we're not judging anybody here. A good WrestleMania, and one that I always enjoy going back and watching at least once a year for, if no other reason, like I said, to skip through some of the other bullshit to get through to Hogan and Savage for the title. This is a match that felt like it belonged on a WrestleMania main event. And I miss those days of the WWF and WWE where you put Hogan and Savage together in 87. You've got this big thing happen at WrestleMania 4 where Savage wins the belt. And you're building up this entire time knowing that at WrestleMania 5, it's going to be Hogan and it's going to be Savage. And by this point in time, frankly, Vince probably already knows at WrestleMania 5 that at WrestleMania 6, he might be having an interesting match on his hands. He might be ready to have Hogan versus Warrior for the WWF Championship. I miss that long-term vision and long-term booking of the WWE because it really produced some memorable matches, some memorable feuds, and some memorable moments, and frankly, some memorable WrestleMania shows.